Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll just give it another 2 seconds for folks to load into the Zoom room. My name is Yasmin Tanachan Blacklock. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Associate for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Engineers Canada, and I am absolutely thrilled to welcome you all to today's webinar. To mark National Indigenous History Month, Engineers Canada has partnered with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, or the CCAB, and their very, very impactful Progressive Aboriginal Relations program, the PAR program, to host this webinar. Before we begin today, I want to walk you through some guiding principles for our meeting. We strive to build an inclusive learning environment, so I'd like to remind you to keep the conversation respectful, to recognize that we are all in different places in our learning journeys. We all have different lived experiences, and we expect everyone to maintain an open mind. Please be mindful of how your words might impact others and ultimately lead with empathy for both others and yourself. There's going to be an opportunity for audience questions at the end of the presentation, so please mute yourself while our presenters are speaking to avoid any interruptions, and we'll let you speak to them a little bit later in the hour. We have absolutely fantastic speakers today who are going to be sharing their knowledge with you. Luanne Whitecrow is the director of the Progressive Aboriginal Relations program and is in her 10th year at the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, helping guide organizations build sustainable strategy in Indigenous relations through the PAR program. We're also joined by Nicole MacDonald, who is the chair of Engineers Canada's Indigenous Advisory Committee and a senior project manager and team lead at Colliers Project Leaders. She works primarily with Northern Indigenous and not-for-profit clients and communities to deliver impactful and such important projects such as drinking water infrastructure and community, cultural, recreational, or care facilities. It is my pleasure to hand it over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I have about half of a voice today, so I'll do what I can here. But I'd like to open our gathering today just by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. And while we meet today on a virtual platform, we acknowledge the importance of the lands where we each work and live. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. More specifically, Engineers Canada is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and in the area that is known today as Ottawa. Thank you for joining us during Indigenous History Month, and as we approach National Indigenous Peoples Day, discussing a topic that can have a tremendously positive impact on Indigenous peoples and communities and on society as a whole. So, with that, I think we're good for introductions, Yasmin. So I think I can hand it over to Luanne to lead us through an intro on the PAR program.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Luanne Whitecrow. I'm the director for the PAR program for the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. I'm very honored to be here today, and thank you for taking the time today to come and learn about the Progressive Aboriginal Relations program, one of CCAB's oldest programs. Today, I'm going to give you a short session on an overview of the PAR program. I'm going to share my screen, and we're just going to look at what the program is to give those of you on the session today hearing about PAR for the first time, just an overview of what it is and how it works, and what we're currently doing with this program. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen okay, Nicole? Everyone?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so this is the Progressive Aboriginal Relations program. It is CCAB's oldest program. It's been around since 2001, and it was designed to help organizations build out long-term strategy around hiring around these 4 drivers, specifically the leadership actions driver, which is executive. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Sorry. The executive leadership team around hiring Indigenous, around business development and partnerships, and then community relationships, which is all about engagement and support. So this program is about 21 years old. This particular model that you're looking at here is about 5 years old. We did a redevelopment in 2015 when we noticed that there was some fluctuation in participation. Organizations weren't able to sustain their efforts, so we had to look at what their reasons were for, signing on and opting out. So with their feedback, we redeveloped this criteria and relaunched in 2016. We currently have around 190 organizations across various sectors within this program that are undertaking a PAR process at this time. And I think it was largely the increase in participation and increase in sector participation has been attributed. There's the factor around the increased participation had to do with the rebuild, but also organizations were looking at ways to answer TRC calls to action, ways to actually execute a good Indigenous relations strategy in a way that was sustainable, and in a way that they could demonstrate their efforts around reconciliation, and in a way that they could actually see that they were making progress. Okay, so I want to show you these two levels. So I want to spend about 15 minutes just showing you the model and some of the high level points about how it works. And then we will go into some reflections, some insights, and some discussions with Nicole. Okay, so this criteria here that you're looking at is a process of progression. So organizations, they come in different levels. They come in from various scenarios. Just typically 2 scenarios they come in with. They come in with an existing strategy, or they come in, with starting out with, they don't know what they don't know, and they start from the very beginning. So this committed level process, where it says PAR committed criteria, phase 1, 2, and 3, is a framework building process. Very simple. That'll help an organization set up structure, method, process, and practice in the very first 3 years of their participation in PAR. And what that really does for them is it helps them build method, process, a structure, and a strategy, right? They're building out good inclusion, engagement, and dialogue early on. They're training the organization internally, right, through this framework building process over phase 1, 2, and 3. The executive leadership is required to be involved in the very first 3 years of participation. We have different types of organizations in this program building out their frameworks at this time. But really what this process is about is to make sure that the organization gets started and gets set up in the right way and in a meaningful way. So their training requirements are required to be built out over phase 1, 2, and 3. So in the very first year, they're building out a working group, deciding on their scope of impact. Phase 2, they're basically talking with those communities, those businesses, or those Indigenous employees on seeking their input to identify ways to hire, train, procure, engage, and support, right, in phase 2. And then year 3, they're setting targets, okay? It's very, very simple inclusion, engagement, and dialogue process that's required to happen, that they're required to build out good process approach internally, internal to the organization in the very first 3 years. And then there's cultural awareness training requirements. There's PAR training requirements that are required to be built out over this 3-year process as well for phase 1, 2, and 3. So, and it really, that training for both PAR training and cultural awareness training is designed within this framework building process to help the organization reset their thinking and their process approach when they're approaching communities, when they're approaching Indigenous businesses around a procurement strategy, or creating accessibility within their supply chains, or even just very simply partnering with those businesses or those communities, even the economic development corporations as well. So this is what they're doing in phase 2, really having those focus groups and discussions, and then they'll set the targets in year 3. But they're identifying their scope in phase 1. Phase 2, they're talking with them, and then phase 3, they're setting those targets. The training is designed, the PAR training is designed to raise the visibility and importance of Indigenous relations in the first 3 years. The PAR training is basically saying, here's the 4 drivers, here's what we are doing with the 4 drivers to train and educate everyone within the organization over this framework building process. And then there's also cultural awareness training requirements for phase 1, 2, and 3 as well. And it'll be the same streamlined rollout as the the PAR training, where they're training the executive leadership in phase 1, mid-level management in phase 2, and then staff in phase 3. And the importance of that is just to ensure that they understand the history, protocol, etiquette, and approach of Indigenous communities in Canada. From the baseline, from the First Nation side alone, we have around 634 First Nations across Canada with different types of history, protocol, etiquette, and approach. So as you can imagine, some of these training strategies can, depending on where the company is operating or the organization, or where they're impacting in, and this is what we really encourage organizations to focus on, right, as it relates to where their impact is happening in Canada. This program is still a Canadian-based program. We have received express interest from other organizations or from other countries for their Indigenous communities, but today it's still a Canadian-based program. There's a verification system built within this model. CCAB has around 11 trained verifiers that support these organizations reporting into the program once they start building out their framework for phase 1, 2, and 3. Their job is to ensure that they build a nice system before they
I think we might have just lost Luanne there. I see another comment in the chat. Someone else had lost audio. So maybe we'll give it just one more minute and see if she can join us again. These things always have to happen naturally.
Everybody's on something at lunch hour. Yeah, we might have lost her. I can just speak quickly while we're waiting for her to rejoin about Engineers Canada and their journey to initiating, in the POWER program. I think I might as well do that since that was the next thing I was going to talk about. I am here, wearing two hats today, one of them being the chair of the Indigenous Advisory Committee, and I do see a few members of the committee here today too, which is great. There are a couple of people on that committee who have previous experience with either CCAB membership, as their company, or as being part of the POWER program. So they had brought that suggestion forward. So for a bit of context, I'm sure lots of people know, but Engineers Canada, isn't doing engineering work in interfacing with communities on a regular basis. Engineers Canada represents the provincial and territorial regulatory associations, but we recognize that engineers and engineering work have direct impact on Indigenous communities, have historically very much still do so today. There haven't always been the best outcomes, but there's a lot of opportunity in the profession, to improve the way that we engage and build relationships with communities and the way we deliver projects. So I think the group saw it as a very natural thing for Engineers Canada to do, was to first become a CCAB member and then also, pursue the POWER program. So I think if I had to identify a few, say, goals for certification, they would be, to address gaps within Engineers Canada's organization. So there are very, conscious organization on diversity and inclusion and increasing those within the engineering profession. And, obviously our committee talks about Indigenous inclusion and increasing those numbers in engineering. I think the process will really better help Engineers Canada prepare for future engagements and relationship building with other organizations or communities. Maybe it's other Indigenous organizations that are not communities. I think really though a big goal would be for Engineers Canada to be a leader for other engineering organizations who are looking and want to build meaningful, lasting relationships with Indigenous communities and other organizations, because we really can all work together to create more positive outcomes in communities. So right now, Engineers Canada is still in that early stage of establishing a working group that Luanne mentioned, really getting prepared. It's kind of that getting organized, probably lowest on the ladder so far, but that's fine. Everyone's really excited and the committee is really happy and excited to support Engineers Canada and the leadership and the staff, going through this journey. So, yeah, it's very early stages, and I'll speak separately afterwards about my experience at my day job. But that's a bit of where Engineers Canada is at. So have we regained Luanne? I don't think I see her.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes, I hear you.
Hi,
There we
everyone.
are. Hey.
Apologies. Yeah, it just went blinked out. Apologies for that. There was a service disconnect for some reason. I don't know what happened.
Perfect timing. I just talked for a few minutes, so you're back on.
Okay,
Good.
fantastic. I can finish up with the model a little bit, but I will share with my screen of maybe 5 more minutes, and then we can go into your session. Okay, I'll just pull up the document again. Okay, so as I was explaining earlier, the verification system is designed to help the organization move forward by providing feedback. It really is the heart of the PAR program. It is aimed to help the organization progress with continuous feedback and improvement over a period of time, even at the certified level, so that when the onsite happens, in the 4th year, when the verifier conducts a one-day stakeholder interview process known as the on-site verification, they'll interview the Indigenous employees, the Indigenous businesses, and the community stakeholders that they identified from phase 1, 2, and 3. So at the certified level, they're applying for a PAR bronze, and basically that framework building process sets an organization up with a bronze level standing. Okay, they'll make a recommendation of findings to a group of PAR jury. The PAR jury assigns a notification of standing for bronze, silver, or gold. Okay, so there are expectations for bronze, silver, or gold, which are based on organizational performance with evidence as they set targets and achieve those targets over a period of time. But really, this program is all about making sure that the organization, the work that they do in communities as it relates to these 4 drivers is measured and tracked over a period of time. So you're seeing lots of reconciliation action plans coming out right now as it relates to TRC calls to action. Organizations are looking for ways to execute this in a way where they can actually track and measure their progress. This is a very effective way that they're currently doing this work in a way that they can demonstrate that the numbers are going up and that they're not going down, and that there's actually indeed progress happening at the community level, and then around Indigenous hire within the organization, and the targets that they set in collaboration with those communities. Yeah, this is just a sort of a high level overview of PAR. We sort of crunched this into a 20-minute session on the model of PAR, but this is the model that most organizations, this is the model of PAR, and this is the process of progression that they're following from the committed level framework building process leading into bronze, silver, and gold. The certification expectations, like the reporting within PAR for certified level, is every 3 years. So say, for an example, an organization certifies in 2023 at bronze. The next required recertification will be 2026 with the expectation that they will go to silver, and then 2029 with the expectation that they'll go to gold. Okay, so logo use rights are given to these organizations depending on where they're at in terms of their process and their method and their practice. Also, along with their results as well, and evidence of that of those results as well. So I think what we'll do right now is we'll go into, I will stop sharing my screen and let Nicole take over here to provide her presentation on PAR. And okay.
Great.
Okay.
I love that visual, and the 4 drivers I think are so important. Like I'd say companies who are working with Indigenous communities or groups might sort of naturally by their business just be doing some things towards 2 or 3 of those, but like to really encompass all 4, I think is so important. So let me just share over here. I think you can see that. I just have to swap the view a little bit. There we go. So I started on my second slide because the first one was just for me to talk about Engineers Canada starting on the journey to PAR certification. So I gave a little high-level overview because it's so early on right now. So the second hat that I'm wearing is as a project manager at Colliers Project Leaders. So we work with communities all the time, every day, to deliver capital projects. So those could be roads, water treatment facilities and water infrastructure, different community buildings, whether it be community centers, recreation centers, fire hall, community health center, and elders lodge, things like that. So, for many years, the company and the staff members have been doing work side by side with communities. So by virtue of what we're already doing, we want to build those real partnerships with communities, deliver projects that are inclusive, respectful of the community, which could look like a whole variety of things, right? Establishing good project governance, considering different project delivery methods, and what stakeholders are involved, hiring, training, always looking to respect local customs, traditions, cultural practices, engagement early with the community and ongoing through our project. So those things are already, ongoing in our projects. We also want to partner with those communities in a true partnership form so that we can help build capacity. So, eventually those projects could be delivered in-house or with minimal support from, an outside project management firm like us. So, we could be looking to hire Indigenous people from the community, local. We want to provide that training in terms of, how to be a construction project manager, provide that support and mentorship throughout. It could look like something that's very project specific at the beginning, hiring somebody to work as part of a specific project team, and then it becomes something bigger over time, whether they work for Colliers, whether they work for another organization, whether they work for their community directly, delivering projects. We're always looking to increase the number of Indigenous people delivering projects either in their own communities or in other communities. So that could be through project specific things like I mentioned, or being a permanent employee with Colliers. So that stuff, again, already ongoing. And I guess the last point to make would be that, we're always, by virtue of these projects, looking for opportunities for economic benefits for everyone involved, whether it's the community, local suppliers, contractors, things like that. So for us, finding out about the power program, I would say later than we should have, like we probably should have known earlier what it was. It was a very natural fit because we're already doing so many of these things and we have relationships with communities and we're doing projects every day across the country. So I think just by virtue of being such a natural fit, we said, yeah, let's just jump straight into this. So here is a bit of some of the things that Luanne had mentioned as we're getting through the committed criteria, phase 1, 2, 3. So leadership commitment is one of them. I'd say definitely we have that. Maybe it just wasn't something that was written down right just yet. In Indigenous relations policy, it's something that was, here, I'll show some more little pictures here. Something that was in the works, but maybe not finalized yet. Cultural awareness training was something that we rolled out a year and a half ago, and every employee had to take that. And there's actually more coming down the pipe. A communications plan, again, not something we necessarily had written down, but something we would kind of do on a project specific basis. And then some of the data and tracking that Luanne mentioned, around employment, our employees, Indigenous employees have grown threefold in the past couple of years, but are we actually tracking those things? I'm not sure. And setting targets, maybe not that yet either. Procurement, definitely something that we're talking about all the time, how to diversify supply chains on projects, and especially Indigenous and local inclusion, like I mentioned, for projects. And then community engagement and support. So we have those relationships, but are we really setting goals and then tracking how we engage and how we support, whether it's financially or whatever it might be. So when I first looked at the list of what was required just to get through the committed, and ideally get up to the bronze level, it looked like a very long list. But then when I went back and thought about it, I thought, our organization is actually doing a lot of these things already. So that actually brings me, before I got to my next slide, actually, I wanted to add one really important thing. And that was one of the drivers that was on Luanne's chart. And that would be, community relationships. So I had this list here of all these various things that we are doing internally or looking to do, but how do we make sure that the focus for us is on relationships, right? Because that really is in our business what it's about, because we're delivering projects for and with communities. So that relationship has to be central to all those other things that we're doing, or else, why are we doing them? So that was a good, I'd say, reminder for us in starting this process. So my next little slide here, I wanted to show, I've kind of spoken to it now, but just an example of, we're doing all of these things, but are they all going in the same direction and with the same, ideal outcome? So project delivery partnerships, we're talking about those all the time. We're supplier diversity, I talked about that. We were talking about different types of sponsorships or scholarships that we could offer for high school students who want to pursue project management or construction management. I mentioned cultural awareness training, using land acknowledgements. That's a standard part of, presentations, kickoff meetings, like larger gatherings, things like that. We have an Indigenous relations strategy. Is it finalized? I'm actually not sure. I said we had increased our number of Indigenous employees pretty huge in the last few years. And so we have a bit of an informal group happening now. So that's becoming something more formal. There's various marketing initiatives, looking at project profiles, working with communities to highlight projects that have been completed really successfully. Community relationships, one piece of that puzzle as well. HR initiatives, outreach initiatives. There's lots of various things going on in the company. And the reason that I put them sort of here in all these various bubbles is because all these things interact together, but are they happening in coordination, right? Are there all those pieces talking to each other? All the departments actually working together to figure out, like, where are we going as a company? And maybe not, right? All these things are great, but I think they could be so much more impactful if they were more organized. So looking at all these things that we're doing through more of a PAR lens, I kind of said, okay, like, what things are we doing? Let's identify all the things that we're already doing in the company. Or, if it's a company that's newer in their journey with Indigenous relations, what things do we want to be doing? What are we capable of doing right now? I showed all these bubbles and asked, are all these pieces talking to each other? Like, why are we doing each of these things? Like, what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And it can't just be more sales, that that doesn't cut it. And then lastly, from there, the most important questions might be, how could we be doing these things better, right? By having them talk to each other, identifying what the outcomes are and why we're doing them. And another key factor is, are we getting the right feedback and from who? So that, again, is a big piece behind the community relationships driver, right? Who are we talking to? What communities do we have relationships with? Are we going out there and getting that feedback from them? So that's a really important question that I think we are realizing we have to improve on, for sure. So the last, colorful bubble slide that I want to show here is just all those same things we were already doing within the company, just need to get organized. Let's all, work together, see each other, figure out how we can be a lot more organized. And also we need to do a bit of a gap analysis still. So looking at the drivers, there's a couple of them that maybe these bubbles don't quite fit into just yet. And I see that right now as leadership commitment, just getting, I know that we have that because we talk about it. The leadership is quite involved in some of these individual initiatives, but are we really documenting that and sharing it? And then business development, I would say, yes, just by virtue of what we do, we're creating these partnerships with communities, but this is not just about who our clients are, right? It's about who the suppliers are, who the other organizations are that we have relationships with to help deliver these projects. So I think those are two that will help us really fill out this circle here that I created and really drive all four of those drivers forward, right? And then the last thing I wanted to mention again was just the relationships, right? And I said this in my words, the relationships really have to be, especially for our type of organization, at the center of all of this. And we have to understand how all of these things are connected to those and how we're getting that feedback on the things that we're doing. So That's a pretty like high level of where we're at in Colliers. We have a working group formed. We're starting to get through phases 1, 2, and 3. I think setting the goals and data tracking will be a couple of the big things that we have to work on as well. I think those were in phase 3. And Luanne, I guess this is a little bit of a question for you. I think I heard that typically it's like about 3 years to get through, excuse me, phases 1 to 3 and potentially achieve bronze certification. But if an organization already has a lot of these things ongoing, it could be faster potentially.
Absolutely, Nicole. So one of the things that when we do intake with a PAR working group in an organization that has just signed on to PAR is they'll look at those 44 questions for the committed level. Those are the framework building questions. And as I mentioned earlier in the overview, is that there's typically 2 scenarios they come into PAR. One is, they have an existing strategy. They're already doing a lot of work, so they can potentially fast track. And the other scenarios are coming in from the very beginning. They don't know what they don't know. In the case that they're doing the work already, they can actually look at those 44 questions and then do a gap analysis against a timeline to see if they could take, instead of the 3 full years, they could take 2 years or a year and a half. And then the committed level has a static structured deadline of April 1st, 2023 for new and recertified companies. That process is a little more structured at the certified level, whereas committed level, once you sign on to the program, that's your start date for phase 1. So it all depends on the industry size and location. So
great. So I'm going to stop sharing this for now. See, are we back to normal now? Yeah, I think so. So that was one question that I had for you, Luanne, and I had a couple other questions that I think would be of interest to people who are listening today.
Okay.
As people from companies who are, maybe either starting the process, thinking about starting the process, maybe they're really new to this, or, maybe they're already certified and they are looking to move up to a higher certification level. And I guess this benefits me as well as a company, within a company who's still pretty new to all of this process. So I wanted to sort of ask you for some tangible examples or like best practices that can kind of get people thinking about, some goals that they could set for the future, where they could see their organizations in the future. And I hope this isn't too general of a question, but, around relationships with communities, are there any good examples of what some of the leading PAR companies, like where they're at in terms of relationships with communities or like what they're doing? I'm trying to visualize like what that looks like for some of those, maybe gold level companies.
Absolutely. We do have some PAR companies that have been in PAR for 20 years. PAR was introduced early on in 2001. Some of them have signed on from the very beginning and have stayed on. And through the redevelopment of the new criteria requirements, from the old criteria requirements to the new, they've managed to migrate successfully in a way where they sustain their partnerships, they sustain their connections, they've sustained all of their conversations in spite of, mergers, COVID, right? So these are some of the ways that, so some of those organizations have been in longer, actually have better practices around Indigenous relations as it relates to those 4 drivers. It is a loaded question because there's so many different scenarios based on industry size and location. So, but I'll just drill it. I'll drill it down to a couple of good examples. The older system really put a challenge on organizations that wanted to talk about the ways they were building out, they were creating good socioeconomic impact in First Nation communities, or creating with partnerships or around hiring and procuring. So that old system really didn't really reflect the type of partnerships that did exist, or they couldn't qualify them in the old system. So when we removed it, we sort of opened this space for companies to talk about the different ways they were impacting in communities that weren't previously reflected in the old criteria requirements. In this new system, this criteria here, organizations can expand their definitions on their partnerships, on other ways they're creating good impact in communities, if they're answering TRC calls to action, if they're talking about systemic issues on First Nation communities, be it food, water, housing, training, education, infrastructure. It's really great to see your organization looking at PAR from that standpoint. It's actually one of the first organizations that are actually looking at these particular systemic issues, right, around roads, water treatment centers, fire halls, infrastructure, right? So this is a huge systemic issue. So it's really great to see an organization step forward to say, we want to make sure we do this in a meaningful way. So that is actually a great example right there, is that you're starting out and you're actually going, we have a call to action here that we would like to answer. We know there's systemic issues communities are suffering from, and they have to live within, right, with these systems. So we want to find a way to meaningfully partner with them to actually address the issue and work towards fixing that issue, right? Or looking at for ways to improve that community, whether it's one of those, whether it's just water treatment plants, whether it's just the roads, right? So those are big items for sure. But that's one way an organization could use the PAR as a roadmap for the framework building process to develop that meaningful partnership, to establish a foundation of meaningful consultation, inclusion, engagement, and dialogue. So that's a perfect example of the work that you're doing right now in communities. That's actually one of the first. You're one of the first in PAR that is actually doing that. So it's nice that you asked that question. Yeah. You probably weren't aware of that, but yeah, and there's different ways. Another really good example is Bruce Power. They under this new criteria requirement that we launched in 2015, they likely wouldn't have been able to have continued certification because of the way their business development challenges. So what they did was, there's not a lot of Indigenous nuclear physicists or not, nuclear doctors and suppliers. Like there's not a whole lot of them. So they were going to encounter challenges around their business development driver, around procurement, around partnering. So what they did was in 2013 was they've come up with this within their business development driver to include or require their supply chain to actually start considering PAR, right? And what that did with a lot of other organizations was they started requiring their supply chains to actually consider PAR and recommend it as well. If they were going to partner, that they require their partners to do this work as well. That was the sort of the thinking outside the box, working around finding a pathway through that. And that's what this criteria essentially supports PAR companies to do. It's not a pass or fail, a rigid score-based system anymore. It's a flexible intent perspective-based system that'll allow an organization to work collaboratively with the community on any systemic issue, for example, right? Or any challenge or gap that might create a barrier between reaching down and connecting with those communities, those businesses, and those individuals, right? So it created a nice, an easier, a pathway for reconciliation that includes the community in the planning process. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think so, for sure. I know we want to leave some time for audience or participant questions, and there's a few coming in. So I'll just ask you one more question for now.
Sure.
And being that it's one of the drivers is employment, I guess I'm thinking more specifically about hiring Indigenous within like one's own organization as opposed to procurement. What are some of the leading companies doing in terms of like attracting Indigenous talent and retaining and supporting them, and providing mentorship, or whether it's there's a fly, specific HR programs like National Indigenous Peoples Day is an extra holiday, or I don't know, just various things.
Absolutely. So during the phase 1, 2, and 3 process, when they're building out their framework, what they're doing is they're incentivizing participation earlier on. That PAR training allows that method that they're using with building out PAR training, saying, here's the 4 drivers, here's PAR, here's why we are as an organization doing it. And it's coming from the executive leadership and down to say that we think this is important, this is valuable, this is why we're doing, this is why we're answering TRC calls to action. We invite participation of our Indigenous employees. So you're incentivizing. Some organizations are creating reconciliation action or reconciliation spaces to incentivize participation. They're now seeking the input from their Indigenous employees as part of their phase 2 discussions, right? Saying how can we improve our organization in terms of attracting Indigenous employees, right? How do we increase that Indigenous representation within our organization? What are some things we could do under the employment driver, right? So this is the way they're doing it. They're incentivizing, creating that safe space in phase 1, 2, and 3 by providing that cultural awareness training to increase the awareness of why this is important, why they're doing this work, and they're training everyone within the organization. So some of these, and cultural awareness training as well is a huge part of it throughout their framework building process. You include those Indigenous employees within the organization to participate in that cultural awareness training. You're raising the visibility and you're resetting the thinking and the process approach, and you're creating awareness, right? And that safe space for them to want to self-identify, to want to participate, right? Through that framework building process. So this is what the verifier will drill down into when they're looking at the other questions. We'll focus on, the frequency of engagement during that 3-year timeline with community, internal and external, to make sure there's good engagement, good meaningful engagement happening in a way where it's being received in a meaningful way. That's just one best practice that they're working on during that committed level framework building process. Other organizations are building out manager and training positions. So they're, rather than just creating entry level positions, they're looking at upward mobility. They're looking at making sure they have a retention strategy that ensures that there's an advancement opportunity leading out of an entry level position so that they sustain their efforts to keep their Indigenous employees. Okay, yeah, so those are just
Great.
2 examples.
Those are great examples. Thank you so much.
So I believe we're going to move into an audience Q&A session. I just want to let the audience know that this session is being recorded and we are going to have it on our website and our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to appear on video, that is totally okay. You can keep your video off. If you'd like to be completely anonymous, you can type your question into the chat and I can read it for you. But you are more than welcome to raise your hand, turn on your video, turn on your mic, and ask our speakers yourself. As folks are thinking about their questions, I'm going to go ahead and read the first one off from the chat. And this is for Luanne. Are you able to share with us if any Government of Canada departments or agencies have participated in the PAR?
At this time, not yet. It is our hope that due to the way we built the criteria in 2015 and redeveloped it and relaunched it, we had realized that this is for any organization. So hospitals could be looking at it. We have trained all the municipalities, all the major cities in Canada in PAR for them to consider the case for participation to support their reconciliation efforts. We have looked at hospitals. So certain sectors that normally wouldn't have undertaken PAR are actually now looking at it. In terms of government, we have no government or ministry participation at this time. Hopefully, we would love to get them to come aboard and see the value of a sustainability criteria in Indigenous relations that might help them do better in Indigenous relations. But as of to date, we have the major towns and the cities look at PAR. We've had hospitals. Hospitals are now, we've had increased interest with hospitals undertaking PAR to answer those systemic issues. And even First Nation health authorities. So there's some health authorities that have taken an interest, and we now actually have universities and colleges. So sectors that normally wouldn't have looked at PAR prior to 2015 are now looking at it due to the rebuild of the criteria. So we would hope to get more government participation in the next 5 years. It would be a dream that a goal that we're looking towards. So hopefully sooner than later, we can have them aboard PAR, undertaking a framework building process for themselves as well.
That's wonderful. One of the questions we have right after that was actually about educational institutions or programs or faculties within universities. Are they able to become certified? And maybe you could speak a little bit about what that process has been like, if there are any unique obstacles for folks in those positions.
Absolutely. So yeah, we've had some, I think we have 2 colleges and 2 universities in PAR, and they are currently in a framework building process at this time. All the companies that are in PAR are on our webpage. So if you go to ccab.com, and then you go to the programs in the PAR pages. We have a list of all the organizations that are currently undertaking a PAR process for the committed level. So that framework building process is where most of the growth in PAR is actually happening right now. And since the relaunch, they're moving towards certified. So some of them are coming out of phase 3, moving into certified. But as it relates to the education sector, I think one of the main, what we were hearing a lot from those interested within the education sector, are they want to build a framework that creates, I guess, authentication of their representation within their organizations or their educational institutions. To increase Indigenous representation, for sure. That was one of their major challenges. I think also, given that universities are so, they're large institutions. One of the things we started working on with one of the universities was piloting, just to see if one of the departments within the university would look at PAR and see how well they would do in it. So that was one of the approaches we've taken with the educational institutions that were looking at PAR. Because building out a working group for an organization with an employee size of 30,000 in an educational institution would be felt overwhelming. So we had to take sort of an incremental, realistic approach with that particular institution to say, let's try one, see how it goes, and then we can expand on that process development for the rest of the departments, should there be an interest, right? So yeah, that was the approach we've taken with educational institutions.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And it makes sense to do kind of a smaller trial run, I guess you could call it. And then we had another question about the publicly published list of PAR organizations. I popped the link that Luanne was mentioning in the chat, so you're able to access it there. Nicole, our next question is for you. How did you get your company to buy into PAR? Was there a tipping point that allowed you to move in this direction? There's a lot of experiences of lots of talk, no action. How can we get this moving?
Yeah, I can imagine. So it's funny. The topic came up, I would say, maybe a year and a half ago, at a working group type meeting on Indigenous business and things like that. And I think it was me that brought it up because I had heard about it through Engineers Canada. So, and somebody said, oh yeah, we thought about that a few years ago, but like, we just didn't know if it what we were going to get out of it or whatever. Like, I don't know if they had fully explored it, honestly. Maybe it was before I was with the organization. And so of course, any company is going to look, okay, like what's the cost? Like, okay, it's not too much money. Like, who's going to work on this internally, that kind of thing. So they were able to get past that hump pretty quickly because it was not, too much money, and there was somebody from whoever who could work on it. I think the commitment internally to so many of the Indigenous initiatives, whether it be employees or partnerships with communities, that stuff was already ongoing, right? So it's not like it was a hard sell, right? So I don't know if I can fully answer Corinne's question to know what it's like to be in an environment where there isn't a lot of that. I would say though, the key tipping point was around hiring and employment. So we said, okay, I suppose any for-profit company would say is okay, what are we going to get out of this in terms of our sales and stuff? Is there going to be some benefit? Well, okay, everybody said no, maybe not immediately, and that's not the point of this. I think we made that very clear. That's not the point of why we're going on this journey. But if one of the key outcomes for us was to just generate more relationships with people and organizations and communities that can then bring in more Indigenous employees and help us to train more and more people, I think that was really the key driver. We keep using the word driver, but I think that was really where we could see the biggest benefit, if we had to pick one, right, for us. So I guess you could call that the tipping point, right, where everybody said, okay, this is really going to help us to both internally and externally expand those relationships and connections, and ideally just get access to more people, right, who we can hire and train and help to support communities. So I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Yeah, wonderful. Luanne, next one is for you.
Sure.
Can a company outside of Canada get a PAR certification as well?
At this point, it's still Canadian based. We would have to have a chat about that, and I'd have to talk with headquarters to see if there was a possibility. I'm always thinking outside the box. I would love to look at other. We did have expressed interest from other, from the United States, from Peru, as I mentioned earlier, Australia, Mexico. Was looking at it in terms of the mining sector. Very interesting conversations. It would be an interesting road to take. At this time, it's still Canadian based, but if there was ever an interest, I would encourage you to send me an email to see what we could actually do. So yeah, it's not impossible and it's not a no, but it's definitely a conversation that is coming up more, right? Some of the existing PAR companies currently in PAR wanted to expand their PAR processes to their Indigenous communities, say for example in Australia, which was, to me, my eyes, I would love to see something like that. But at this time, it's still Canadian based, but you know, it's hopefully in the future, we would love to do something like that.
Yeah, definitely. That expansion, the work you're doing is so incredible. To have it expand, it just makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't have any other questions in the chat, so I'll give an opportunity for anyone if they want to come forward and ask the question with their voice. And if not, we still have a little bit of time. Nicole, I know you had a few questions remaining, I believe. We could maybe go through a few of those.
Yeah, for sure. I had a few in my back pocket. And actually, just to follow up on the one we just talked about, is there a comparable organization in the US to the CCAB? I just don't know. I've never looked it up.
Not that we know of, as it relates to the PAR system, like this program and this system remains the only system in place with with all the mechanisms built within it. Of course, it is about 21 years old, so it has been a system in the making, right? So subjected to annual improvements on it. So with continuous feedback as well.
Sure.
From all those.
But there must be like just an organization like for Aboriginal business or Indigenous business.
I'm not sure of the organization. We're not currently partnering with any US based organizations at this time. But yeah, it would be something to look forward to seeing, right? Especially increased participation with our Indigenous communities in the South. That would be amazing.
I see a question. Sorry, you don't have to read it, Yasmin. I guess I can. So you mentioned staff working on this. Yep. Can you tell us a bit about the workload from Colliers and how CCAB provided support? So yes, so internally, the person who spearheaded, I guess, reaching out to CCAB and starting the process was somebody from our business development team, but he is located in Manitoba, and they do lots and lots of work there with Indigenous communities. So he had some relationships and things. And he was the one to just sort of initiate the whole thing. So now we're actually in the process of kind of turning it over where our Indigenous employees are going to lead it. I think it's maybe going to be shared among a few people who have a little bit of time to spend some hours here and there. I can't say right now, I'm just trying to think, I can't say how many hours or anything I think it is in terms of their workload, because we're really just diving into it now. We just kind of started that transition to the employee group taking it over. But management, knows that and is supportive of that. And we're basically an internal stakeholder on this anyway. So there would still be leadership and management as part of that process, obviously. How CCAB provided support? Well, we did our initial training session with Brenda, it was Luanne. Beyond that, I'm not sure if there's been too much back and forth on questions just yet. It was more okay, let's get started, and then we have to internally really sit down and get ourselves organized before I think it's useful for us to go back and ask any questions or ask for support. So I don't think we've had to really ask for that just yet. But maybe that's a question for you, Luanne, is how does the CCAB provide support throughout if a company needs it?
Absolutely. So when an organization sees the value of PAR and they sign on to the PAR program, we do have a support system in place for the framework building process for the committed level. We do have facilitators. So if an organization can't if it feels too overwhelming, and say the organization is an employee size of 50,000 or something, and they need the extra help, we do have facilitators that can come aboard to help the organization in sort of leading the working group through that process. Like that phase one requirement is to build the working group, get everyone organized, look at the definitions, and that external partner, they act as sort of an external par lead to the working group, so to help them guide your thinking throughout their framework building process. And we also do all the training sessions on the questions for phase 1, 2, and 3. They're all free training sessions in a Zoom call or a virtual call just like this. I found prior to COVID, we were already doing this, saves on time, travel, and energy, just to do a session just like this with the full working group, because representation for that working group sometimes was in 4 or 5 provinces. So it was easier just to have a call like this to go through the questions, the framework building questions, at which point they'll reconvene after the session. So we do have that training, those training sessions, they're all free. And we also have cultural awareness training. We have a roster of trainers, cultural awareness trainers that you can source from the website as well, that you can help build your own training internally. You can source your training internally to your Indigenous employee representation within your organization as well, to build out your own training for yourselves. Or you can come in with an existing partner. And if you're already working with a trainer, you can continue to work with them as well. We also have the verifier support that gives you feedback as you build out your framework, to give you strength and suggestions on how to strengthen that framework. They're there basically to make sure that you applied that PAR framework in a consistent manner before they send you to certified. So they're the ones who actually clear you to move into certified, so they don't send you there send you to the wolves, basically, right? So you want to make sure that they set you up with a nice system before they clear you to move into the PAR certified level, where you'll begin progressing through bronze, silver, and gold. So there are supports. Excellent. And we do quarterly check-ins once we train the working group in the organization to ensure that they're on the right track and that they're building their framework in a timely manner, right, within the time requirements. So I hope that helps.
Definitely.
Would you like to, I see your hand raised.
Well, I don't want to take, I'm sure other people have questions, so I don't know if there's other questions you want to answer before I shoot another one.
You are all good to go, please.
I hope other people on the call are benefiting from my questions. Okay, so without spilling the beans on where I'm from, but I'm guessing you've already figured that out. To kind of follow up on the all talk, no action. So in the organization I'm working with, there's a lot of action happening on the grassroots, and a lot of willingness and participation from the few Indigenous staff that we have here. But so then it percolates up, and then it kind of hits a wall where the people on the other side of that wall are like, yes, this is great. Yes, we give support. And then when you say, okay, so let's put this in an implementation plan and put it in action, and then they come up with, oh, but we don't have the money. Oh, but there's no money to get out of it. Oh, but there's no actual potential. But have you ever done your homework to figure out if there's potential? Oh, but there's no potential. So they come up with these lame, I'm very,
That's okay.
I'm French speaking, so you probably understand there's not much filter. I use the words I can use in English, and that makes it less diplomatic sometimes. But what happens is then you wind up in a situation where people believe in it, people support the belief, but there's no action happening because the initial awareness, the removal of racism or perspectives that are biasing the potential of what this is. So the people who, I'm going to put myself in that bucket, the people who have awareness, who have connections, who have relationships, know why this is important. Mm-hmm. The people that don't have that assume it's not, say that it's important, but they don't see how it applies to them. So you wind up in a situation where you're trying to convince them of something they say they support, but then when it comes to the fact, they're like, oh, but it doesn't really apply. Like it applies to me as a Canadian, as a citizen,
Mhm.
But
Absolutely.
like in my job, you know, there's not many Indigenous people doing this. They don't have money. They don't have capacity. They don't say that out loud, but in the lame excuse they give, you can understand that they are not aware. They're not knowledgeable, or if they
Yes.
are, they're racist, period. Because you can't not know and say these things in be like overtly aware of what you're
Yes.
saying. So I wonder if there are some, I'm not asking the question to Nicole because I know you're less far in the process, but I was wondering if Luanne maybe had some insights on, because I'm stuck. I'm hitting the wall and
Understood.
getting too many bumps in my face right now that I'm at the point where I want to sit down and lay on the bed and just take a nap.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you're hitting a wall with upper management and the resistance to this process. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's all about just bringing them into a session like this, inviting them in, and then showing them the value and the opportunity, the value and benefit in a way where it lessens the resistance, right? Oftentimes we get executive leadership teams going, I don't see how this is not relevant, or they just can't see it. So oftentimes, or they'll come in and say, we want to do this work, but we don't know what to do or how to get started. And we're not sure for it's good intent, poor execution, right? So this is often the resistance behind that resistance. So we want to make sure that we lessen that resistance by taking them through a process like this so that they understand how it could work for them, right? Like this system is for them to navigate in a meaningful, respectful way, in a way that lessens that. I don't even want to touch it because for their own fear. So we just talk with them and expand their thinking to say, if you were to do Indigenous relations, and why would you do it? And really help them formulate for themselves the reasons why they would do this work, right? Rather than the problem, right? It's like we know the problems, and we know that there are issues around communities being, procurement ready, engagement ready, supplier ready, partner ready, and they know that too. So they don't see a pathway through. PAR gives them a pathway through in a way that includes them to have a conversation directly with the committee. So PAR meets the organization from where they're starting out at, and it helps that organization meet the community from where they're starting out at. Does that make sense? So it's just a matter of having continued conversations about lessening that resistance. I hope that helps. And is it Corrine?
Yes,
I would love to have a separate call with you if you're interested.
I would.
Yeah, I would love to have a conversation with you. Because don't worry, I've lots of parleys. There's, we're hitting 200 companies. A lot of parleys have had the same issue you have. So, and I would love to connect you with some of our PAR champions as well that know this very, very well. They've been doing it for some time, and they'd be happy to have a conversation with you as well. And so would I. So it's all about just formulating that mission, vision, and focus to help them see the same thing that you're seeing, right? In a way that makes sense, of course. So I'd love to have a continued discussion following the session if that is an interest to you.
Wonderful. So I see we're just at the top of the hour there, which unfortunately means we are out of time. But I just want to extend a huge thank you for both Nicole and Luanne. Your time is so appreciated. I know I learned so much, and I know a bunch of folks on the call probably appreciate your time as much as I do. And I hope everyone has a fantastic day. Stay well.
Thank you. Thank you,
so
everyone.
much,
Have a great
everyone.
day. We'll talk soon.
Bye.
Bye.